The emergency broadcast cut through the static at 3:47 a.m., jolting Marcus awake with words that would haunt him forever. If anyone can hear this, my daughter is trapped in Roosevelt Elementary. The dead are everywhere, but she's alive in classroom 3B. Her name is Emma. She's only 7. Please. The transmission ended in screams. Marcus stared at the radio, his heart hammering against his ribs. 3 months had passed since the outbreak began, 3 months since the world collapsed into a nightmare of flesh-eating corpses and abandoned cities. He'd grown numb to the constant broadcasts of desperate survivors, but something about this one, maybe the father's broken voice, maybe the mention of a child, pierced through his carefully constructed emotional armor. The door to his makeshift shelter burst open. You heard it too? Jake stumbled in, his face pale in the flickering candlelight. His best friend since childhood looked like he'd aged a decade in the past few months, his once bright eyes now hollow with the weight of everything they'd witnessed. Roosevelt Elementary, Marcus whispered, pulling up the mental map he'd memorized of their city's layout. That's 15 miles through the dead zone. Jake slumped against the wall. 15 miles of those things. And for what? Some kid who's probably already? He couldn't finish the sentence. Don't. Marcus's voice was sharp. Don't say it. They sat in silence, listening to the wind rattling the boarded windows of their abandoned warehouse refuge. Outside, the familiar sounds of the infected echoed through the streets. The dragging footsteps, the guttural moans, the occasional crash of something being knocked over in their endless, mindless wandering. Marcus closed his eyes and suddenly he wasn't in the warehouse anymore. He was back in his apartment 3 months ago, watching his younger sister pack her overnight bag for a sleepover. She'd been 7 too, with the same excitement in her voice that he'd heard in that desperate father's transmission. I have to go, he said suddenly. Jake's head snapped up. What? That little girl. Emma. I have to try. Marcus, no. Jake stood, his voice rising. We've been over this. We don't play hero anymore. We can't save everyone. But we can try to save her. Can we? Jake's laugh was bitter. You know what Roosevelt Elementary looks like now? I drove past it 2 weeks ago on a supply run. It's a death trap. The infected broke in during the first wave. The whole building is crawling with them. Marcus was already moving, pulling on his jacket and checking his weapons. His knife was sharp, his modified crowbar clean. He had maybe 30 rounds left for his pistol. Not much, but it would have to do. I'm going with or without you, he said, avoiding Jake's eyes. Why? Jake grabbed his shoulder. Why her? Why now? Marcus finally looked at his friend, and Jake saw something in his expression that made him step back. Raw, unhealed pain that Marcus had been carrying like a cancer in his chest. Because I couldn't save Lily, Marcus whispered. Because I watched my sister die and I couldn't do anything about it. Because maybe if I save this one kid, maybe I can sleep at night without hearing her scream. Jake stared at him for a long moment. Then he sighed and reached for his own gear. Roosevelt Elementary, you said? You don't have to. Yeah, I do. Jake strapped on his baseball bat, worn smooth from months of use. Someone has to watch your back when you do something this stupid. They spent the next hour planning their route, studying the hand-drawn maps they'd created of infected movements and safe passages. The school was in the heart of the city, surrounded by dense clusters of the walking dead. Getting there would be a nightmare. Getting out alive, with a 7-year-old girl, would be a miracle. As dawn approached, they made their final preparations. Marcus tucked the radio into his backpack, hoping to catch another transmission, any sign that Emma was still alive. Jake distributed their remaining medical supplies between their packs, his movements efficient despite his obvious reluctance. You know this is insane, Jake said as they approached the warehouse's reinforced exit. I know. We're probably going to die. Probably. Jake looked at his best friend, the man who'd saved his life countless times since the outbreak began, and made a decision that would change everything. Then let's go save that little girl. Part 2, Into the Dead Zone. The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets as Marcus and Jake made their way through the skeletal remains of downtown. Every footstep echoed too loudly in the unnatural silence. Every breath felt like a betrayal of their location to the creatures that wandered these concrete graveyards. They'd been walking for 2 hours, following the route they'd mapped out in the safety of their shelter. The plan was simple: stick to the back alleys, avoid the main thoroughfares where the infected congregated, and reach Roosevelt Elementary before nightfall. Simple plans, Marcus had learned, rarely survived contact with reality. Movement, Jake whispered, pointing to a storefront window 50 yards ahead. Marcus squinted through the morning haze. A figure shambled past the broken glass, its movements the telltale jerky shuffle of the infected. They pressed themselves against the brick wall of a former coffee shop, waiting for it to pass. The infected had once been a woman, maybe 40 years old, wearing a blood-stained business suit. Her face was a ruin of torn flesh and exposed bone, her eyes milky white with death. She paused directly in front of their hiding spot, her head tilting as if listening to something only she could hear. Marcus held his breath, his hand tightening on his crowbar. Beside him, Jake was motionless, his entire body coiled like a spring. They'd learned in the early days that the infected were drawn to sound and movement, but sometimes they seemed to sense things beyond normal perception, a sixth sense that made them infinitely more dangerous. After what felt like an eternity, the creature moved on, disappearing around the corner with that horrible shuffling gait. Marcus and Jake remained frozen for another full minute before Jake finally exhaled. "Too close," he muttered. They continued their journey, but the encounter had shaken them both. The infected were becoming more unpredictable, their behavior patterns shifting in ways that made survival increasingly difficult. Some of the survivors they'd encountered claimed the creatures were evolving, becoming smarter, but Marcus preferred not to think about that possibility. The radio in his backpack crackled suddenly, making them both freeze. Static filled the air, then a voice, weak, barely audible. "Day 3, still here, running out of water?" Marcus fumbled for the radio, his heart racing. Emma, can you hear me?" Only static answered him. "It was her," Jake said, his voice tight with tension. "She's still alive." "Day 3, Marcus repeated. "The broadcast was 3 days ago. She's been alone in that school for 3 days." The weight of that realization settled over them like a lead blanket. 3 days with no food, limited water, surrounded by the walking dead. Marcus tried to calculate how long a 7-year-old could survive under those conditions, but the math was too grim to complete. They picked up their pace, abandoning some of their caution in favor of speed. The back alleys gave way to wider streets, and the number of infected began to increase. They moved in small groups now, packs of 3 or 4 creatures that seemed to hunt together with disturbing coordination. There, Jake pointed ahead. The school. Roosevelt Elementary stood like a fortress of nightmares in the distance. The red brick building was surrounded by a chain-link fence, but massive holes had been torn through the metal mesh. The playground equipment was twisted and broken, scattered with debris that Marcus didn't want to examine too closely. But it was the infected that made his blood run cold. The school grounds were crawling with them. Dozens of creatures wandered the courtyard, clustered around the main entrance. Some wore the remnants of teachers' clothing, others the small uniforms of children. The sight of infected children never got easier, no matter how many times Marcus encountered them. "How the hell are we supposed to get in there?" Jake asked. Marcus studied the building, looking for any possible entry point. The main doors were blocked by infected, the windows on the ground floor were either broken or boarded up, and the fire escape on the south side was surrounded by at least 20 creatures. Then he saw it, a small window on the second floor, partially hidden by overgrown ivy. It was their only chance. "The utility pole," he said, pointing to a telephone pole that stood close to the building. "We can climb up, jump to the roof, then lower ourselves down to that window." Jake followed his gaze and grimaced. "That's at least a 10-foot jump. In broad daylight. With 50 infected watching from below. You have a better idea?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying the school and its deadly perimeter. Finally he shook his head. "No. But Marcus, if we do this, if we actually get inside, we need to be ready for what we might find." "What do you mean?" "That little girl has been alone in there for 3 days. Even if she's alive, even if she's uninjured, the trauma?" Jake's voice trailed off. "She might not be the same kid who went to school 3 days ago." Marcus nodded, understanding the implication. They'd seen it before. Survivors who'd been pushed beyond their breaking point, children who'd witnessed horrors that no human mind should have to process. Some came back from that darkness. Others never did. "We'll deal with that when we find her," Marcus said. "Right now we just focus on getting inside." They spent the next hour observing the infected, noting their movement patterns and looking for any possible distraction. The creatures seemed to migrate in loose clusters, never staying in one place for more than a few minutes. But there was something else, something that made Marcus's skin crawl. They were organized. Part 3: The Climb. The utility pole was older than Marcus had hoped, its wooden surface weathered and cracked from years of exposure. As he pressed his hands against the rough bark, he could feel it give slightly under his weight. 50 feet below, the infected wandered through the school courtyard, their movements creating a hypnotic dance of death. "You sure about this?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Marcus tested his grip on the metal spikes that served as climbing holds. No choice now. They'd waited for the optimal moment, when the largest cluster of infected had shambled toward the eastern side of the building, drawn by some sound or scent that only they could detect. The window they targeted was still partially blocked by overgrown ivy, but Marcus could see through the green curtain to the darkened classroom beyond. He began to climb, his muscles burning with the effort of pulling himself up while making as little noise as possible. Each movement had to be calculated, controlled. One slip, one loud crack of breaking wood, and they'd have 50 infected looking directly at them. Jake followed close behind, his breathing steady despite the obvious strain. They'd done this before, scaled buildings, navigated obstacles, performed desperate acrobatics to stay alive. But never with stakes this high, never with a child's life hanging in the balance. Marcus reached the crossbeam that would serve as their launching point. From here, the jump to the school's roof looked even more daunting. The gap was at least 12 feet, and the landing would be on a sloped surface covered in loose shingles. "Change of plans?" he whispered down to Jake. "The roof's too risky. I'm going straight for the window. That's 15 feet and you'll be completely exposed." "It's the only way." Marcus positioned himself on the crossbeam, his legs coiled like springs. The window was directly across from him, maybe 20 feet away and slightly lower. If he could generate enough momentum, if he could control his trajectory perfectly, he might be able to crash through the ivy and into the classroom. If he missed, he'd fall directly into the courtyard full of infected. He took 3 deep breaths, centering himself the way his old gym teacher had taught him during high school track and field. Then he leaped. Time seemed to slow as he flew through the air. He could see individual infected below him, their upturned faces tracking his movement. The window grew larger, the ivy reaching toward him like grasping fingers. For a moment he thought he was going to fall short. Then he hit the building. The impact drove the air from his lungs as he crashed through the ivy and into the classroom. Glass shattered around him and he rolled across the floor, coming to rest against a row of small desks. Pain shot through his left shoulder, but he was alive and inside. "Marcus." Jake's voice came from outside, urgent but still whispered. Marcus got to his feet and looked out the window. Jake was still on the utility pole, but now every infected in the courtyard was looking up at him. The creatures had heard the glass breaking, and they were beginning to cluster around the base of the pole. "Jump," Marcus called softly. "Now." Jake didn't hesitate. He launched himself from the crossbeam, his trajectory carrying him toward the same window Marcus had used. But he was heavier and his angle was slightly off. He hit the window frame hard, his hands scrambling for purchase on the sill. Marcus grabbed his friend's wrists and pulled, hauling him through the window just as the infected below began to moan and claw at the air. They collapsed together on the classroom floor, both breathing hard. "That was insane," Jake gasped. "Yeah, but we're in." Marcus looked around the classroom for the first time, taking in the scene that surrounded them. The room was a disaster. Desks were overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and dark stains marked the walls and carpet. But it was the silence that was most disturbing, the absolute absence of any sound that might indicate life. "Emma?" Marcus called softly. "Emma, are you here?" No response. They moved carefully through the classroom, checking behind overturned furniture and in the supply closets. The room was empty, but there were signs that someone had been here recently. A small pile of crackers on the teacher's desk, a child's jacket hung carefully on the back of a chair. "She was here," Jake said, pointing to the makeshift food cache. "But not anymore." Marcus picked up the jacket, noting the name tag sewn into the collar. Emma Patterson. The fabric was clean, well-maintained. This wasn't the jacket of a child who'd been surviving alone for 3 days. "Look at this," Jake said from across the room. He was standing next to the classroom door, which was barricaded with desks and chairs. "She blocked the entrance." "Smart kid." Marcus joined him at the door, and they carefully moved the furniture aside. The hallway beyond was darker than the classroom, lit only by the emergency lighting that somehow still functioned. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of infected moving through other parts of the building. "Which way?" Jake asked. Marcus pulled out the school's floor plan they'd studied earlier. "Classroom 3B should be down this hall around the corner." "But Jake." He pointed to the floor. There, barely visible in the dim light, were small footprints in the dust. Child-sized prints leading away from the barricaded classroom and deeper into the school. "She's moving," Marcus said. "She's alive and she's smart enough to stay mobile." They followed the footprints down the hallway, past abandoned classrooms and broken lockers. The school felt like a mausoleum, filled with the ghosts of normal life that had been shattered in a single day. As they rounded the corner, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold, a child's voice singing softly in the darkness ahead. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." The voice was coming from classroom 3B. Part 4, The Child in the Dark. The singing stopped the moment their footsteps creaked on the worn linoleum floor. Marcus and Jake froze in the hallway, straining to hear any other sound from classroom 3B. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. "Emma?" Marcus called softly, approaching the door. "Emma, my name is Marcus. I heard your daddy's message on the radio. We're here to help you." Still nothing. The door to 3B stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. Marcus noticed that unlike the other classrooms they'd passed, this one showed no signs of forced entry. The door frame was intact, the lock undamaged. Whatever had happened here, it had happened from the inside. Jake positioned himself on the opposite side of the door, his baseball bat ready. Marcus counted silently, 1, 2, 3, then pushed the door open. The classroom was a study in organized chaos. Desks had been arranged in a precise circle around the center of the room, creating a small fortress. Inside the circle, supplies were neatly stacked: water bottles, crackers, a small pile of books. It looked like a survival camp built by someone with an adult's strategic mind but a child's limited resources. And in the center of it all, sitting cross-legged on a small blanket, was Emma Patterson. She was smaller than Marcus had expected, maybe 3.5 feet tall, with dark hair that had been carefully braided despite her circumstances. Her clothes were dirty but intact, and her eyes, those were what stopped Marcus cold. They were the eyes of someone much older, filled with a wariness that no 7-year-old should possess. "You're not supposed to be here," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor Marcus could detect underneath. "Emma, we're here to help you," Marcus said, keeping his voice gentle. "Your daddy sent us." Her face crumpled for just a moment, revealing the scared child beneath the composed exterior. "Daddy's dead," she whispered. "I heard him screaming on the radio after the message stopped." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by the child herself made it real in a way that statistics and assumptions couldn't. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it completely. "I'm so sorry, Emma." She nodded solemnly, accepting his condolences with the same unnatural maturity she'd shown since they'd found her. "The bad people came on the first day. They broke down the doors and hurt everyone. Mrs. Henderson hid me in the supply closet before she—" Emma's voice trailed off, but Marcus could fill in the blanks. He'd seen enough schools in the aftermath of the outbreak to know what had happened here. "How have you been surviving?" Jake asked, his voice unusually gentle. Emma pointed to her carefully organized supplies. "I know where the vending machines are. In the kitchen. I only go out at night when the bad people are sleeping." "The bad people?" Marcus asked. "The ones who got sick. The ones who want to hurt us." Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. "They sleep during the day sometimes. That's when I move around." Marcus exchanged a look with Jake. The infected didn't sleep. They were driven by an endless hunger that kept them moving constantly. But Emma seemed convinced that they had rest periods, and she'd survived for 3 days based on that belief. "Emma," Marcus said carefully, "we need to leave here. It's not safe." "I know." She stood up and began packing her supplies with practiced efficiency. "I've been waiting for someone to come. I knew they would eventually." "How did you know?" She looked at him with those 2 old eyes. "Because that's what people do. They help each other." The simple faith in her words made Marcus's chest tight. In a world where humanity had largely abandoned compassion in favor of survival, this 7-year-old still believed in the basic goodness of people. "We need to move fast," Jake said, checking his watch. "It's already past noon. If we're going to get out of here, we need to do it while we still have daylight." Emma nodded and shouldered a small backpack that looked too big for her frame. "I know a way out. The bad people don't use the basement." "The basement?" Marcus asked. "There's a tunnel. It connects to the storm drains. I explored it yesterday." She said this as if exploring dangerous underground passages was a normal after-school activity. Marcus looked at Jake, who shrugged. They'd planned to leave the way they'd come, but if Emma knew a safer route, they'd be foolish not to take it. "Lead the way," Marcus said. Emma picked up a small flashlight and headed for the door. As she passed Marcus, she paused and looked up at him. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I knew someone would, but I was starting to get scared." You don't have to be scared anymore, Marcus promised. We're going to get you out of here. She smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and for a moment she looked like the 7-year-old she actually was. They made their way through the school's corridors, following Emma's lead. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd memorized every hallway, every hiding spot. When they encountered infected, 3 of them clustered around a water fountain. She simply led them down a different route, her movements calm and purposeful. How many times have you done this? Jake asked as they descended a staircase toward the basement. Every day, Emma replied. I have to check the other classrooms to see if anyone else is hiding. The basement was a maze of storage rooms and mechanical equipment. Emma's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow maintenance tunnel that looked like it hadn't been used in years. This way, she said, crawling into the tunnel without hesitation. Marcus and Jake followed, their larger frames making the journey more difficult. The tunnel was cramped and filled with the smell of rust and decay, but it was mercifully free of infected. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they emerged into a storm drain that ran beneath the school. Emma had been right, it was completely clear of infected. How did you know about this? Marcus asked. Daddy used to work for the city, Emma said. He showed me the storm drains once. Said they were like secret highways. They made their way through the tunnel system, following Emma's lead. The girl seemed to know exactly where she was going, turning at intersections with confidence that suggested she'd mapped out this route carefully. But as they approached what Emma claimed was the exit, Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze. Footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps. Coming from ahead of them. And they weren't the shambling steps of the infected. Part 5. The Hunters. The footsteps grew closer, echoing through the storm drain tunnel with a rhythm that spoke of purpose and coordination. Marcus held up his hand, signaling for silence. Emma's flashlight beam wavered as she turned it off, plunging them into complete darkness. 3, maybe 4 of them, Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Marcus nodded, though no one could see him in the black tunnel. The infected didn't move like this, with measured steps and obvious direction. These were survivors, and in Marcus's experience, living humans were often more dangerous than the walking dead. Who are they? Emma's voice was a breath of sound beside him. I don't know, Marcus replied. But we need to find out. They crept forward through the tunnel, feeling their way along the curved walls. The footsteps were clearer now, accompanied by voices, men's voices, speaking in low tones that carried clearly through the enclosed space. Should have found her by now, one voice was saying. It's been 3 days. She's here, another voice replied. Kid's got to be somewhere in this school. 7-year-old doesn't just disappear. Maybe she's already dead. Maybe we're wasting our time. Boss says bring her back alive. That's what we're gonna do. Marcus felt Emma stiffen beside him. These men were looking for her specifically, and they'd been searching for days. But why? What could they possibly want with a 7-year-old child? The voices grew closer, and Marcus could see the faint glow of flashlights ahead. They were trapped. The tunnel only went in 2 directions and the men were blocking their path to the exit. We need to go back, Jake whispered. No, Emma said, her voice carrying a steel that was startling in its intensity. There's another way. She turned on her flashlight, keeping the beam low, and pointed at the tunnel floor. About 10 feet ahead, Marcus could see a narrow side passage that he'd missed in their earlier passage. It was barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through. That leads to the old subway tunnels, Emma whispered. They're flooded, but there's a way through. The subway tunnels had been abandoned for decades, victims of the city's changing transportation needs. Marcus had heard they were death traps even before the outbreak. Flooded, unstable, and filled with hazardous materials. Emma, those tunnels are dangerous, he said. Not as dangerous as them, she replied, nodding toward the approaching voices. Marcus looked at Jake, who was studying the narrow passage with obvious reluctance. Neither of them were small men, and the opening looked barely large enough for a child to navigate comfortably. Check every drain entrance, one of the voices was saying. She's got to be using them to move around. The flashlight beams were getting brighter. In another minute they'd be spotted. Go, Marcus said, pushing Emma toward the narrow passage. Jake, you next. What about you? I'll be right behind you. Emma disappeared into the narrow opening with the fluid grace of a child. Jake followed, his larger frame making the passage more difficult but not impossible. Marcus took one last look at the approaching lights, then squeezed himself into the cramped space. The passage was longer than he'd expected, and his shoulders scraped against the concrete walls with every movement. Behind him, he could hear the men's voices growing louder as they reached the main tunnel. Footprints, one of them said. Recent ones. Kid-sized. There's a passage here. Narrow one. Marcus pushed himself faster through the opening, ignoring the pain as rough concrete tore at his clothes and skin. He could see Jake's feet ahead of him disappearing around a curve in the passage. Too small for us, another voice said. But the kid could fit. Radio the boss. Tell him we found her trail. Marcus emerged from the passage into a much larger space, the old subway tunnel that Emma had mentioned. Water covered the floor to a depth of about 2 feet, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and stagnant moisture. Emma was standing on a concrete platform that ran along one side of the tunnel, her flashlight beam revealing the remains of old subway tiles and rusted tracks. Jake was pulling himself up beside her, water dripping from his clothes. This way, Emma said, pointing down the tunnel. There's a maintenance ladder about half a mile down. It leads to a building 3 blocks from here. Emma, Marcus said as he climbed onto the platform, who were those men? Why are they looking for you? She was quiet for a long moment, her small face troubled in the flashlight beam. I think they're the ones who made the bad people sick. What do you mean? I heard them talking the first day, before everything went wrong. They were in the school in the principal's office. They had these containers and they were talking about how it would spread fast once they released it. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. Emma, are you saying those men started the outbreak? I think so. And I think they know I heard them. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. The outbreak hadn't been an accident or a natural disaster. It had been deliberate. And the only witness was a 7-year-old girl who'd been hiding in a school for 3 days. We need to get you out of here, Jake said, his voice urgent. If they're responsible for all this, if they're hunting you specifically, they won't stop, Emma finished. I know. That's why I was waiting for someone to come. I can't run forever. Marcus knelt down to Emma's eye level. Emma, I need you to tell me everything you remember about that day. Everything you heard those men say. She nodded solemnly. They said something about a test. About seeing how fast it would spread in a closed environment. They called the school a controlled population center. Jesus, Jake breathed. They used the school as a testing ground. There were 4 of them, Emma continued. The leader had a scar on his face right here. She traced a line down her left cheek. He said they needed to document everything to see how the infection progressed. Marcus stood up, his mind racing. They weren't just dealing with survivors trying to rescue a child, they were dealing with the architects of the apocalypse, and Emma was the only person who could expose them. We need to get her to other survivors, he said. People who can protect her, who can get her story out. The radio station, Jake said suddenly. WKRP. They're still broadcasting from the tower on 5th Street. If we can get Emma there. They'll never let us reach it, Marcus replied. Not if they know what she knows. Emma tugged on Marcus's sleeve. There's something else, she said quietly. Something I haven't told you. What? I know where they keep the cure. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Marcus stared at the 7-year-old girl, trying to process what she'd just said. The cure? Jake asked. They had it with them. In a case. They said it was their insurance policy in case the infection got out of control. Emma's voice was steady, but Marcus could see the fear in her eyes. I know where they went after the school. I followed them. Part 6. The Revelation. The abandoned subway tunnel stretched before them like a concrete throat, swallowing Emma's words and leaving only the echo of impossible hope. Marcus stared at the 7-year-old girl, his mind struggling to process what she'd just revealed. Emma, he said carefully, are you absolutely certain about what you heard? She nodded with the solemn certainty that only children possessed. They called it an antidote. The man with the scar kept touching the case and saying they needed to keep it safe until the test was complete. Jake grabbed Marcus's arm. If she's right, if there really is a cure. We could end this, Marcus finished. All of it. But even as the words left his mouth, he felt the weight of what they were contemplating. 4 men, possibly more, who had orchestrated a global catastrophe, who had turned millions of people into walking corpses, and who were now hunting a child to cover their tracks. And somewhere in the city they had the one thing that could restore the world. Where did they go? Marcus asked. Emma pointed down the tunnel, toward the darkness that seemed to swallow her flashlight beam. There's an old pharmaceutical building about a mile from here. They have trucks, generators, lots of equipment. I watched them for 2 days before I had to come back to the school. You went there alone? Jake asked, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and horror. I had to know, Emma said simply. I had to understand what they did to everyone. Marcus looked at his best friend, seeing his own thoughts reflected in Jake's eyes. They'd come here to rescue a child, but they'd stumbled into something much bigger. The chance to save not just Emma, but everyone who was still alive in this nightmare world. We need to get her to safety first, Jake said. Then we can figure out how to handle the cure. No, Emma said, her voice carrying an authority that was startling. We have to get it now. They're packing up. I heard them talking about moving to a new location tomorrow. Emma, this isn't a game, Marcus said gently. These men are dangerous. They've already killed millions of people. I know exactly how dangerous they are, she replied, and there was something in her voice that made Marcus step back. I've been watching them for 3 days. I know their schedules, their routines, their weaknesses. And I know that if we don't stop them tonight, they'll disappear forever. The tunnel around them seemed to pulse with the weight of decision. Marcus could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness, each drop marking another moment of hesitation, another second closer to losing their chance. What do you know about their security? Jake asked. Emma's face lit up with the excitement of someone finally being asked the right question. They have guards, but only 2 at night. Most of them sleep in the building. There's a loading dock on the east side that they don't watch very carefully. And the cure? Top floor. Corner office. The man with the scar keeps it in a metal briefcase, and he never lets it out of his sight during the day. But at night he locks it in a safe. Marcus stared at her. How do you know all this? I'm small, she said with a shrug. I can get into places adults can't. I can watch without being seen. The plan that was forming in Marcus's mind was insane, suicidal, and their only chance of success depended on a 7-year-old child who had already shown more courage than most adults Marcus knew. Jake, he said slowly, what if we're looking at this wrong? What if Emma isn't the person we need to protect? What if she's the person we need to follow? Jake looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. You're suggesting we take a child into a combat situation? I'm suggesting she's already been in a combat situation for 3 days and she survived it better than most adults would have. Emma stepped forward, her small frame somehow commanding attention in the narrow tunnel. I know that building better than anyone. I know where the guards are, where the cameras are, where they keep their weapons. And I know something else.